This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Walter Greason, who teaches in the Department of History at Macalester College. In addition to a number of scholarly and public-facing publications, projects such as the Racial Violence Syllabus, the T. Thomas Fortune Center, and the Wakanda Syllabus, he is the author of a number of groundbreaking works, including The Path to Freedom, Black Families in New Jersey from 2010, Suburban Erasure, How the Suburbs Ended the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey from 2012, and most recently, in collaboration with Tim Fielder, The Graphic History of Hip Hop from 2024. Across this conversation, we discuss the relation between historical research and Black studies work, the political significance of the study of Black life, and the intersections of teaching, writing, and direct action aimed at racial justice. Walter, hello. How are you today?
Great to see you. Thanks for having me, John.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really glad that we found time to talk. I love your work. I think it's incredibly interesting and important. We'll talk, of course, about history and Black studies and all of that, but I just think the work you're doing is so important and central to the project of Black studies. And so when my collaborator, Ashley, and I were getting together a list of people we wanted to talk with, you were on that list. And so it really makes me happy to have you on this. And I'm really thankful for you making the time. So welcome.
Yeah, please know the feeling's mutual. And the fact that you're doing this is an enormous service to everyone who is in higher learning and can benefit from these kinds of innovative technologies. The use of the podcast is so important. So thank you for doing what you do.
That's really nice of you to say. I appreciate that. It's a labor of love, and I'm glad that it resonates as important for folks. So thank you for that. Well, let me get started and ask you, we'll get into, Black studies, history, and the field and your own research. But I want to start with really like a more intimate question, more personal question, and just ask you, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life? What is it that got you interested in Black studies? And what sustains you in relation to this?
Wow, huge question. We could do the whole show with that, but I will try to be brief.
These are some of my favorite responses because you learn so much about people's ideas and thinking. So
So I grew up in a rural part of New Jersey around Freehold, which is where Bruce Springsteen was born. And Springsteen's family was not wealthy by any means, but they certainly did better than most of the Black families that were my relatives, who tended to be migrant laborers. Were fortunate to have a church and a small segregated school. And so everybody that came up around me was connected to education, connected to church, and that foundation gave me an enormous sense of purpose about how to move forward with my life. And coming from that foundation, it was ironic, I guess, for a lot of folks that hip hop essentially gave me the final push to say I was going to go into African American history and then to do Black studies for my career. It was really listening to Public Enemy and Boogie Down Productions and their critiques of what had been taught in schools when they were young people, and their demand for more Black history to be taught. That's what pushed me through my anti-apartheid activism in the late 80s and early 90s. And then into the frame of pursuing a doctoral degree that was dedicated to essentially what now, Joe Trotter has defined as African American urban history. So that was the move. I knew what was happening in my community, how it was being decimated as a small farming community by suburbs expanding out and building over the farms where my relatives worked. But beyond that, there was this larger question of the Black world, and so much of what was familiar to me had not been documented and not been archived, and certainly had not been studied at the graduate level or as for professional historians. And so like reading Robin Kelly's Race Rebels was really, it opened the door for me to say, okay, how do I really enter the world of urban studies and place the African American and the African diaspora range of experiences at the center.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, just so quickly, or not so quickly, but you have so many dimensions of the field of Black studies there, right? So religious, cultural foundation, right? Education, hip hop, and then this question of suburbs, urbanity, rural, the overtake of rural landscapes. Um, yeah, this should be this would make a nice retrospective essay, actually, in addition to this preamble into this piece. And I
I'm
was
right at
thinking,
that stage in my career, man, right at that stage of just making that transition to kind of senior scholar and time to look back and take account for what's actually been done.
yeah, no, I mean, it's just when you mentioned anti-apartheid activism, I thought, yeah, I think we're probably the same age. And it is weird to be a memoir age. I would never thought I would be that, but it's a good time.
Angela
Uh,
Davis has a great statement about writing at least 3 autobiographies in your life, right? Write something between 25 and 35 before you turn 50, and then you write another one again when you're about 75, years old. And so it gives you a way to kind of take stock and keep track of different phases.
I like Davis saying that because, her 25 to 30 was so interesting and compelling. I don't know that John Drabinsky's 25 to 30 was very interesting. It's like
But all of us have these things that
underemployed.
people can share and learn, man. All of us have them.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're right. Absolutely. So what you were saying there also reminded me of a previous podcast in this series with Danielle Boos, who teaches in African American Studies and History at Randolph-Macon College, and she was saying that that hip hop is a different generation, but listening to hip hop not only got her interested in the study of African American history, which she does now as a profession, but also this idea that that study could be public facing work or ought to be. So it was hip hop as a path to academia, but also like a shift in the way she thinks about approaching academia and the study of Black life. I mean, do you think it had that kind of impact for you as well?
Hmm. So I'm certain hip hop had the impact of making the inquiry. Um, how do we do the study of the African diaspora and the African continent? That was so huge. The public facing bit was certainly earlier. That came with the educators in my family, the church work that I was doing. I ran my first nonprofit when I was 12 years old. Like that sense of knowledge being essential as a foundation for action. Um, yeah, that was long before I had committed to become a historian. I constantly wrote about through my graduate school years and assistant professor time about the need to take action based on new discoveries, new ideas, new methodologies. So I was an activist before I was a historian.
Hmm.
My undergraduate years, I went to Villanova University, and I chose to go there because a student at a college fair didn't see me standing behind him, but said to a group of white students, I love Villanova because there are no Blacks or Latinos there. And so he did not say Blacks or Latinos. He used much more colorful language.
Yeah.
But I went immediately to the table as I was being trained by a South African exile who was fighting against apartheid. And I found they had scholarships for Black students. And I was like, I'm going to win one of these scholarships, and I'm going to attend this school, and no one will ever show up at a college fair again bragging about how racist this institution is. And so that was not a great decision to be just a healthy 17, 18-year-old to go off to college and declare war on your institution. But like,
It's
that was what
courage.
I did. And so, yeah, the action that's behind the scholarship for me was always the reason. Like I had to work. We had mentioned previously off air that education is the center of what you love about higher ed, and that's very much what I was drawn to. It was a much longer process for me to get into and to accept the necessity of research in order to do good teaching and good service to community. And so I didn't really come to the place of trusting my writing and believing in the vitality of writing and then the need to grow new archives until I was almost past the tenure line, probably, good 20 years into doing the work.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it's hip hop energizes me. It is the soul of why I do what I do. But it was forged by this crucible of being in the Black church, being connected to a lot of Black servicemen, people who had been part of the Army or the Air Force, or even law enforcement, and did it out of a civil rights tradition that required a lot of discipline, a lot of sense of how to marshal physical force to meet white nationalism and segregationism. So the activist piece was there for me way before I got to be a scholar.
Ah, that's amazing. That story about the table at Villanova. I mean, that's a really compelling story to put out there. It reminds me of that opening, bit from Souls of Black Folk, where Du Bois is like, here's the crossroads, right? He has this moment with this little girl, and he's like, I vowed to be, the best, to beat them physically in the classroom, on the track, and so forth. But also, as you were saying, not was that the safest or smartest decision? I mean, even Du Bois is kind of like, this is a rough road to travel. Yeah.
I can't think of a more kind or generous thing for someone to say to me. Du Bois and Paul Robeson have been the guiding lights for my life. So every decision I especially within the academy, I'm constantly reflecting on the rare opportunities I have and how solemn the responsibility is to attempt to try and carry Du Bois and Paul Robeson's legacies. And so for me, that's been every waking moment. Like I have dreams and I meditate and keep my spirit focused in that framework. And I'm having to confront the physical costs of it. Like my body is not as strong as it used to be. And so, I'm having to make careful choices every day about what I can continue to do. But I know all of us, Manning Marable writes about it in his biography of Malcolm X that starts the final chapter. He's like, there's a cost, and there's a cost, and eventually the price comes due. And so, I the last 5 years, pieces of my cost have come and hit me. And so I continue to just stay focused and do everything I can. But I'm thankful for the thousands of young people, scholars coming up behind me who can do things that were unimaginable when I got started.
Yeah. And yeah, if Robeson and Du Bois are your conscience, and your light. I mean, that's also a tradition. I really hope that younger scholars really, and it does seem to me to be the case, always have that in mind of, the new things that become possible generationally. So, yeah. Well, let me ask you about the field of Black studies and how you imagine it. Sort of, what's the portrait of Black studies in your mind when you think of the field? And I ask this in relation to its origin story, right? That Black studies has, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, a sort of tense origin. One is this need to establish a place in the academy, on campuses, in classrooms where you could study Black life, something that the disciplines had barely done, if done at all. And Black studies was going to be that place where the Black intellectual tradition, culture, art, expressive life had a place. But also alongside that, and with some tension, was the emergence of radical Black liberation struggle that was really collapsing the space between the campus and the community, but also between study and political activism. And so I think, it's 50-something years since the founding of the field, but I think that still hovers around our idea of what Black studies is and what it means to engage in this field. And so for me, I'm always interested in hearing what folks on the podcast think about the field of Black studies in relation to that origin story, how you imagine it today.
So no, I teach it very much as an outgrowth of the student demand at San Francisco State, and this effort to say this is not the white faculty, liberal or conservative, having a moral awakening and believing all of a sudden, oh, we must rethink methods and rewrite what we have done. This has been a wrong that we've inflicted. Like the academy, the majority of the academy, the white academy, has no interest in Black scholarship, and it's still rare.
Yeah.
25 years into the 21st century to find white scholars who come aboard and really ground themselves in Black scholarship. Like that's an extraordinarily unusual thing. And so for me, there's a piece that aligns with the community activism. I was fortunate to get my PhD at Temple University, but my advisors were extraordinarily emphatic. They said, get your degree in history, not in Africology. And they were just very sanguine about what the nature of academic job markets are, and that there are some jobs that are held aside for Black studies candidates. And then there are jobs that are then open within these predominantly white departments for faculty in the various disciplines. And so that always made me queasy, if not nauseated. And so there was a part of me on the ninth floor of Gladfelter Hall studying history that always made a point to go one floor down to the eighth floor and to know Dr. Asante and to know the students and the faculty teaching and developing African American studies and Africology. And within that, to then spread out and understand the different schools of Black studies, whether it's San Francisco State or the Cal system, Texas or Louisiana or Florida. There are all these different hubs. My mentor at Villanova is Magan Keita. He's a product of what Frank Snowden had done basically at Howard, building out a revision of the ancient world and crediting Africa for shaping Mediterranean culture. And so there were all these ideological threads that were also tangled up with the independence movements on the African continent and the difficult politics among the various different state actors between 1960 and 1990. And so all of that made me committed to a kind of comprehensive sense of Black studies where I have a deep respect for whatever approach someone takes to come to the area, but like I have an equally robust critique for someone who is kind of isolated and siloed and doesn't appreciate the range of other potential approaches. I think the saddest thing I see for me in the academy is that there is a really deep sociological wedge between historically Black college and university faculty and predominantly white institution faculty. Often predominantly white institution faculty feel like they cannot be respected or gain tenure or promotion working with HBCU faculty, which is completely false. HBCU faculty feel like predominantly white institution faculty don't do enough to reach back and connect and build resources, especially the SURF community, which is often not the case, but there's just not the open communication. I do my best to spend as much of my time building bridges, building connections, and making everybody I find stronger. And ironically, I'd say that has made me a lot of enemies. There are a lot of people who don't want strength across all the disciplines and different approaches. They want to kind of proprietarily hold on to their ground and stake that out that they are successful and others are not. Mm-hmm. And to me, in a project of liberation, that's self-destructive. And so recent debates around Ibram Kendi and around Nicole Hannah-Jones have shown me a lot of this kinds of territoriality and sense of who is where and who is real and who is allowed to be successful. And for me, I just stay grounded in community. Wherever I go to present, I do free events for youth groups. I do free events for food shelters. Like, I'm always connected to the people who are meeting the needs of the most vulnerable. And all of the academic prizes and different kinds of awards and television appearances are not secondary. They're not tertiary. They're like, if those things come along, they are incidental to the larger mission. And so that doesn't make me a lot of friends. A lot of people in the academy are about status and about exclusivity, but I just have a different mission.
I mean, look, I could not I could not be uh, more sympathetic with just this, desire or wish and disappointment that comes with it, but that the success of Black studies or the breakthroughs that Black studies and Black studies scholars have done when it doesn't lead to, I mean, it's true of academia generally. This just happens to be the Black Studies podcast, but where a group or a person's or a few people's success doesn't proliferate success, but as you say, sort of turns into to gatekeeping and whatever we want to call it, critique. And I don't know. I wonder in the next 4 years as we get ready to live under a far right government, like what does it mean to have internal fights that are often life or death fights, or at least posed as that, rather than disagreements? Because disagreements it's good to have a healthy,
Of course.
debates. I mean, obviously, but Gerald Horn's podcast just came out a couple of days ago, and he was saying in a different context, but he was like, in times of crisis, you need numbers, and that's why these questions of transnational solidarity are so important politically and culturally. And I think we're in Black Studies about to be in that. What are our numbers? Which also goes to what you were saying before. I mean, the place of the study of Black life in a serious way at universities and colleges is so thin once you get outside Black studies. And so are those places outside the field going to be there for us under attack? I don't like the answer to that question.
No, and nor should you. I mean, it's clear, we have very, very many sunny day friends. When it starts to rain, we find ourselves standing out without an umbrella. And so a lot of the work I've been doing since early November is providing strategies for shelter, escape, and survival so that folks can continue to do not just, the essential work of housing and feeding and clothing people, but also how does study evolve? How does education evolve in a world that is actively trying to censor and ban and burn the knowledge that we've created in the last generation or two?
Yeah. No, yeah. What is it going to be like to listen back to this podcast in 4 years? I hope we sound overly paranoid, but I don't think we will. But let me ask you about your work. Your work is invested in such an interesting mix of historical methods and deep engagement with popular culture, urban studies. You've talked a bit about it. And there's so much insight into Black life that comes from this particular sort of combination or conflagration of approaches. And so I'm interested in thinking about your own approach in your work, how you see it in relation to the past of Black studies. Where does it sort of fit in the tradition? But also, what new horizons do you think it's opening up for the field?
I was extraordinarily flattered. My colleagues in San Francisco took my first book, The Path to Freedom, Black Families in New Jersey, and used it as a touchstone in creating a Black family studies curriculum that actually looks at the nature of Black family and history. And I remember in doing the interviews and gathering the archive that I did for my first two books, I was struck by the mythology that I had been taught, really out of the Moynihan thesis, cultural poverty idea, that, Black families were matriarchal and matrilineal, that the father was absent, all of this garbage that they had propagated in first promoting the welfare state, but then destroying it. And what I found were these extraordinary lineages of Black families that had thrived through segregation and then built all these institutions and sustained all the infrastructure that made the Southern Civil Rights Movement possible. And so the just layers of mythologies and deceptions were astonishing. And that's what turned me towards the commitment to creating new archives and preserving ranges of documents that would dispel these kinds of stereotypes that shape so much of the study about people of African descent anywhere in the world, for that matter. And so once you start thinking in terms of, okay, if I'm going to do a project, there has to be a commitment to expand the archive. That's just a different challenge than most of the other historians I know who love to recognize or locate an existing archive and then find the documents that no one has pulled out before, and then they'll craft a book or an article out of it. When you take the step earlier that you have to create the archive before you can then begin to process the data and interpret it for your manuscript, it's a different process. It gives you a different sense of how knowledge is created. And I'm very blessed to be able to teach that. I just got done teaching a Black women's autobiography class that's the central skill the students are taking away from it. And so the family studies piece is big. There are three major pieces that then flow that developed out of that foundation. When I did Suburban Erasure and it started to win awards, the phrase itself kind of caught fire and became viral online right as Twitter was becoming more popular. And so now the idea of the physical and social erasure of vulnerable communities has become a regular phrase, a regular lens that people use to understand. When I started doing the work, gentrification was the only mode that people understood. In response to me arguing about erasure, people developed the concept of displacement, that urban neighborhoods being pushed from one location to another. But now people are taken very seriously. Thousands of graduate students are saying, no, this isn't just displacement. This is an intentional attempt to destroy the memory of a people and their contributions at various places and times. And so I'm deeply grateful for the way that young people have caught on and used it in all kinds of contexts that I could have never imagined. But that was the first one. The second one is the most contested piece, is racial violence. Again, when I was coming up, almost everybody framed rioting as a Black activity. They talked about it as burning white businesses, non-Black enterprises, particularly out of Rodney King, tensions with Korean business owners. And I remember being, as a young graduate student, stunned to go back and learn that no, the vast majority of race riots are white natives and Europeans that had immigrated here that just destroyed whole Black communities for most of the 19th and early 20th century. And that just was not part of the public discourse. And so when the first rumblings about Tulsa started to get public attention in the mid-90s, that opened the door for all of us to start to say, no, you need to study the history of lynching. You need to study the history of white riots against Black communities. And that just opened up a massive door for me to teach a course at Drexel, where my students had never encountered any of the information before, and they became visibly shaken, physically ill, would often weep in class as they had gone through it. And I made a decision never to teach all the material in one block like that again, because it was too terrible for people who had never seen any of it before. And so I split it up into multiple courses, continued to teach it, but it was 2017, after the Unite the Right rally in Virginia, that I basically talked about that teaching experience online, and it went viral. Like, it was 4 billion people used it in the next 2 weeks in 7 languages.
Oh,
and like, it just changed the world's perception. Like, it gave the reasoning to say, okay, no, we cannot keep Confederate monuments up. Like, this is not appropriate. And just the global ignorance about the violence endemic to white supremacy. Very proud that I had a part of that. A lot of scholars have now published new books and then gone in to really make that very clear, including pieces of the 1619 Project have made the racist violence foundation something that they cannot let anyone forget. So I'm glad for that. But then the third piece was the Wakanda syllabus. So around the same time, I had had a hobby for about a decade writing Black science fiction, and got to work with the writers Reginald Hudlin and Christopher Priest for Marvel Comics, and got to design the urban layout and infrastructure for the Black Panthers' capital city. And so this was just something fun online that I was just using my skill set for. And then when the Iron Man movie came out, the people I was talking with were all like, "Oh, we're going to need something more robust. There's going to be a Black Panther movie at some point." And so I compiled it in 2016 as a Wakanda syllabus of all the kind of Afrofuturist writers and designers. Um, 2 years, it was wild, viral, just people everywhere picking up on it, and just caught like wildfire when the movie hit, when everybody got to see the visuals that Ryan Coogler and Hannah Beachler used based on what we created in the syllabus. It won every prize. It was like 2 years of just miraculous engagement. And it still goes on. Mostly what people know about my work is using real world architecture and economic thought to say, what would Africa be without colonialism and massive white imperial domination? And so that's been by far the most liberating piece. Afrofuturism continues to just open new doors for me. And then the final thing is the thing I'm working a lot on now is grounding and making the plans for reparation much more specific. And so came out of the era of the debt and Randall Robinson and the anti-apartheid movement. But what struck me was he wasn't using any of the language that economists use to kind of shape public policy. And so I spent about a decade reading Claude Anderson's Powernomics, teaching Manning Marable's How Did Capitalism Underdevelop Black America, Walter Rodney, and really learning macroeconomic vocabulary and then twisting it and exposing it for its flaws and dealing with people of African descent and most of humanity, frankly, including Europe, misrepresenting what economics are. And so I've become a huge critic of Milton Friedman and anybody who follows him, anybody who works for Treasury or any central banking institution. An ally to William Darity, who does with stratification economics what I had been demanding for years, is to use historical evidence to guide economic modeling. Modern monetary theory and Stephanie Kelton are huge allies that show us the way they manipulate the idea of debt to create austerity and disproportionately punish Black populations, Black nations around the world. That work for me is under the umbrella of asset value analysis. Did a book with Darity called The Black Reparations Project. And that's what contributed most for me to Black studies, is this way of taking our vision of a better world and showing how we build the economic systems that make it real. And so it's those four areas that I feel like have connected most to the interdisciplinary project of Black studies. I'm proud to say hip hop is my foundation, and that gives me an entry point into the larger debate. But it's taking these social scientific and traditional humanities tools, showing how broken and flawed they are, and then improving them so that they actually serve the people who need them most.
So just to be clear, you just outlined four, multiple, I'll just say multiple accomplishments that all of the rest of us would love to have one of those in our lifetime. I mean, that was a fantastic sketch of contributions to Black studies. And that's really profound stuff. I mean, it goes to all those dimensions of Black studies. The last piece you were talking about, I love the way you put that. Things that aren't quite right or broken or partial in social science and humanities, and in the Black studies context, actually able to work in a different kind of space and different things become possible. All that stuff with the imagination and urban studies with the Wakanda syllabus. But even just going back to, you're talking about suburban erasure and thinking about how it's just a simple shift in terms just can reframe the world. I mean, when you were talking about gentrification, I have my own experiments it's in my classes because I don't write about this, but I often will just say, what if we didn't call it gentrification? We called it, instead we called it ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
And they look shocked, and I say, well, what's the difference? And then they can't generate a difference. And I say, well, then why do we have a reaction? I say, it's not just you, me too. I say, if we call it ethnic cleansing, like that freaks me the fuck out, right? To call it that, because I think, I mean, by age, but I think like Yugoslavia.
Yes.
And I think about people behind barbed wire and starving and what that meant for international mobilization. So now we all of a sudden look at these things that we just may be calling it gentrification, right? And so when you're talking about this like shift in vocabulary at that, using these, being able to use social media, I mean, it's hard to imagine in this post-election moment, social media having such a positive transformative effect. But you talk about these viral moments that you've had, they shift people's entire vocabularies, and that translates into action. I really believe that.
No, it's the reason why the billionaires want to seize control of that apparatus is they saw there were grassroots people learning different ways of communicating, better ways of taking charge of their lives. I remain inspired every day by Zeli Amani that's in northern New Jersey. We were talking about COVID response, and he had never heard the phrase mutual aid before. And he heard it and then read about it and then went out and organized a massive campaign to feed the elderly, the disabled, the vulnerable in his community. And it became a national mutual aid network that all these people at the local level were collecting food, collecting medicine, being able to meet their own needs in an environment where the social infrastructure failed them. And so those are the moments where I take tremendous inspiration that it's just our ability to connect to each other with just small lessons. They don't have to be these huge, profound, grandiose things that change our behaviors, but they can actually make the quality of our lives so much better. And I'm convinced that's how we survive and overcome the adversity we're facing right now.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, all of this has been worth the conversation, but this little piece here makes this all of this time in this podcast worth it. Thank you for that.
Brothers, this is the only time we have. We got to do what we got to do right now.
Yeah, seriously. This is not waiting time. This is not safety time, whether it's climate or far right governments. So, well, let me draw back into the question of Black studies and ask you how. Looking at the history of the field, I think in some ways you've already spoken to this, but I'll ask in some ways to sort of ask the question again. What do you think that the field of Black studies has done particularly well in its 50-something years? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
So the things that have done well are almost innumerable. From the foundation of students just asking, how do we get more access to basically Black history and literature was mostly what the demands were, where you're getting entire methodological and theoretical revisions of what constitutes knowledge. I don't think anyone will be able to grapple with how profound those successes in the last 50, 60 years have been for another century. It's going to take an extended period of time to appreciate the way we have rewired the civilization's brain and heart using Black studies. Like that is, when I try to do my little explanation, and this gets to, I guess, a good transition point to the second part of your question. I talk about 100 years ago in 1920, everyone believed Black history was fiction, that there was no African past to recover or to learn from, that it was impossible to conceive. This is notably what Du Bois or Wells Barnett or any number of writers are combating. It took another, at minimum 50 years, if I'm generous, to even conceptualize the idea of a Black future. The idea that there are people of the African diaspora that can be represented in fiction in some distant future society. And it took another 50 years beyond that for the two things to intersect, to be like, yes, there's Black history. Yes, there are Black futures, and we need to understand and explore all of it. And so these are long journeys, but Black studies is at the center of how that process occurs. And so that's where I say the successes are limitless. It's just we can't always see and appreciate them in the moment that we inhabit. In terms of things that can be done better, I mean, this gets back to the thing, our own human frailty, our jealousies, our envy, the way that people are nervous. I just started a project, the graphic history of hip hop with Tim Fielder. And what I've seen as I've toured with him about the condition of Black writers and artists, struggling to gain a foothold, begging to get literary agents so that they can get contracts to keep food on their tables, to pay their rent every month. I'm horrified. When I see the kind of comfort and luxury that many Black studies scholars or Black scholars generally have accrued, and they can essentially live their lives on vacation, touring from one major global capital to another. And then I see tens of thousands of Black writers and artists that are essentially starving and in danger of losing their homes or dying every single month. As an institution, in my opinion, Black Studies has a responsibility to provide for the next generation of creativity. I take great solace and comfort from an artist like Nas, who has built a Grandmaster Foundation program so that every year, multiple MCs who are struggling with health issues that were legendary artists 20 or 30 years ago will get health insurance and like a retirement salary for their contributions to hip hop. We need that for Black studies. We have a generation of Black scholars who are within a decade of passing away, our founding generation. What are we doing to secure their legacies and to make their last years much more comfortable so that they're not facing the story of Paul Robeson is always the one that drives me. This man was everything. The best athlete, the best attorney, the best scholar, best actor, the best singer, like invented the foundation of what we would consider Black studies with his life. And after losing his passport and fighting the government to get it back, the whole country turns their back on him. My man dies in squalor in West Philadelphia after 3 years of being housebound. Like, incomprehensible to me. And so that's the failure that I worry about regularly, is what are we doing to build for the stable post-notoriety moments of our Black scholars. The fact that Cornel West is traveling the country, tearing himself to shreds to pay bills. Mm-hmm. Like, it's hideous. It is hideous. And so our collective sense of investment with each other has to get much stronger.
I love that. I have not heard anybody articulate that. I think I'm going to be thinking about that a lot. Thank you for that. That's, and as soon as you started talking about it, I actually was baffled by the fact that it had not come up, that I have not thought of it that way. So thank you. That's really important. And as you said, it's like, these are the people that made our lives possible if we work in the field or even adjacent fields. And what does it mean to be self-absorbed and not community connected across generations? I like that. That's fantastic.
No, man. I come from a spot where I helped a couple of older faculty get more stable in their last years. And so it just made it really apparent to me. So like, I have to give a shout out to Clement Price, who is a legendary faculty member at Rutgers Newark. And the work we did together made his final years very comfortable, but also built a center to continue his research that now benefits like dozens of Black scholars every year.
I love that. Let me ask you a future question. You talked about, these questions of Black futures, Afrofuturism, maybe a sort of futurism of Black studies, to get a sense of, it kind of in some ways comes back to the original question I had about how you imagine the field of Black studies. But what would be an index of the success of Black studies in the future? Would it be connected to that origin point, right, where fields of study hadn't taken account of Black life? Black studies steps in to do that. And I think Black studies stepping in, over 50-something years and deepening and widening our sense of the study of Black life has changed disciplines. I mean, I think English and history departments, for example, have been really, really changed by that. But is it in the future the success of Black studies is that to have changed the disciplines in such a way that Black studies itself maybe isn't necessary anymore? Or is the success of Black studies to define itself as genuinely distinctive in some way, not to become a discipline, but to become akin to a discipline that can't really be absorbed by other fields of study?
So my answer is going to get you in the most trouble on this one. This is the one. If you want to flag it, this is the one that'll bring the people to listen.
Content warning.
Yes. So I want to say a decade ago when I was doing my study of global economics and looking at how the macroeconomic system of central banking is a house of cards. What I discovered incidentally was the field of African studies as sponsored by the imperial powers out of Western Europe. And this is essentially, London and Paris and Berlin, and to a certain extent, I guess you could say Madrid, underwriting to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year, white Europeans writing about the African continent and the African diaspora in ways that are deeply problematic. And for me, a measure of what has to happen now, particularly in the wake of this election, is for the decolonization of African studies as a profession to bring in Black studies scholars, African diaspora studies scholars, to lead these very well endowed institutions across Western Europe and to engage in a massive reparations campaign, both material and intellectual, to provide a global foundation for the work that Black studies has done. I think that is an extraordinarily doable goal, particularly as the United States distances itself from NATO and fractures its relationships towards isolationism. There's a grounds to relocate African studies out of Western Europe and into the African continent, and more importantly, into the Caribbean and the Maroon regions of Latin America. And that this provides an opportunity for folks who study the things that we study to access the wealth attributed and stolen from people of African descent and to repurpose the knowledge production outside of the United States in a way that is beyond the reach of this Russian-sponsored, Israeli-organized, North American dictatorship that's emerging. So that's, to me, I've been sitting here making concrete plans about different kinds of transformations. And if I could grant one wish, it would be everybody that is in Black studies to have the resources that are given to African studies.
Well, maybe that's already an answer to this last question I had for you, but I'll ask it anyway. Which is, first of all, I don't think that's a thing to flag. I think that's actually a really righteous call. So I'm glad this is in recording. I love that. But my last question for you is, what do you think's the one thing we should be thinking about? What do you think's the one question you would want us to be asking
right now?
Right now.
So if you'd asked me this 2 weeks ago, it was really, how do you get your people to safety, stability if someone kicks in your door? That is literally the work I was doing immediately after the election. Continuing to do that, but I've now built enough infrastructure that I feel I can move beyond the kind of safety and escape kinds of questions. So the thing that I would say today is really, how do you actually expand your mission in whatever location you're in? So this is particularly important for folks in like Birmingham, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi, or Atlanta, Georgia. But they have to reorient how they think about their world. So it's not like, oh, how are we related to Harlem or Detroit or Chicago or Newark or the Bay Area? We've internalized too much of the American nationalist kind of framework for what we attempt to do. And so tying into Toronto and Vancouver, tying into Kingston, tying into Medellin, Colombia, great colleague of mine, Ronaldo Anderson at Temple University, has built an international movement, the Black Speculative Arts Movement, that's entirely located on the continent and in Canada and in the Caribbean and Brazil. Those connections are what I ask people to consider. How do you engage outside of the linguistic nationalism of English? How do you connect to the diaspora speaking indigenous African languages, speaking Portuguese, speaking Spanish? I got in a lot of trouble a couple months ago hosting an Afro-Latinx history session at a major conference. People showed up and wanted to disrupt it and say any conversation about Afro-Latinx is taking us away from Black Americans' concerns. I think it's just the opposite. I think Black Americans engaging with the history of the Afro-Caribbean and Black Latin America is a way for us to move forward.
I love that. I love that as a place to wrap this up. Those notions of solidarity, transnational contact, strategizing, idea exchange, expressive cultural, solidarities, but also creative work. If that's disruptive, it's disruptive in a really righteous and good way. So, and the learning of languages. It's funny. It's the second podcast in a row where the importance of other languages has come up as not just a research tool, but as a sense of real political and cultural connection of the deepest significance. So thank you for that.
Sir. Oh, it's a joy to be here with you. Thank you. And anytime I can help with the work you're doing, don't hesitate. Let me know.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And, I was happy that we had time to talk. I really love your work, and I was looking forward to this. And this has just been such a thoughtful and interesting conversation. I really, really appreciate all of it, Walter. Thank you so much.
Blessed to be with you, John. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.